Great. So welcome to Data is a Team Sport. This is School of Data's series of online conversations, videos, and podcasts where we are exploring the ever-evolving data literacy ecosystem. For those of you that are joining us in the Hangout, firstly, just really want to say thank you for coming. Here are some guidelines that will help you in terms of participating. First of all, we do need to ask that you stay on mute, and just want to apologize greatly for this. We'd love to hear everyone's voice in the conversation, but this is a less than perfect platform for doing so. So to prevent the painful testing of mics or being in noisy or low bandwidth environments, we'd invite you to use the text-based chat room for communication. So you can do this by hitting the icon in the upper left-hand corner and typing hello and introducing yourself. So please do that. My typing's terrible. If you do have any questions during the Hangout, please type it in the text message box. Caitlin is on hand and she is going to be keeping track of them. Also, feel free to share any comments you may have by typing them there as well. And just a reminder, like I just said, this Hangout will be recorded and broadcasted live on YouTube. A recording is also being made, and it is available on YouTube immediately after we are finished. We are using the audio for our podcast series, and we will also be publishing notes and URLs for everything that gets referenced on the School of Data blog at schoolofdata.org. So let me introduce myself. I am Dirk Slater from FabWriters. Along with being an active member of the School of Data community, we also provide workshops, skill building, consultation for advocates and activists on how to build inclusive data-driven tactics to make social change strategies more effective. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Caitlin Rogers. She is coordinator of School of Data. Hello, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you all for joining. And yes, if you have any questions, definitely type them in the chat box and I will make sure they get asked.
And answered. What we are looking at in this series is the ecosystem needed in achieving data literacy. And we are exploring how this is evolving and adapting in the wake of things like fake news and data-driven confusion. These episodes each explore different elements of the data literacy ecosystem, such as activism and advocacy, academia, and government. Our previous episode explored enabling learning. And for this episode, we want to focus on data-driven journalism. So we have two guests who are pioneers in this area. Eva Constantaras, she builds data-driven journalism teams in developing countries and has spent 4 years in Kenya and Afghanistan doing so, along with a year in Pakistan. Natalia Mazotte has been teaching data skills in different universities and newsrooms around Brazil. She is program manager of School of Data in Brazil and founder and co-director of the digital magazine Gender and Number. So I want to say welcome to the two of you. And to start us off, you both are involved in efforts to make change. Eva, you doing work in anti-corruption, and Natalia in feminism through the Gender and Number initiative. I'm curious if you could start by sharing some lessons learned in working in these areas, and want to start by inviting Eva to start us off.
Hi, Dirk. Hi, Caitlin. Thanks for inviting me, and it's nice to be on this call with Natalia as well. I am joining you from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, where I'm starting a new data project and applying actually a lot of the lessons learned over the last few years. And I think one of the biggest lessons so far has been around using data to prove corruption. And I think our basic lesson there was, in most of the countries I work on, a corruption story using data is not really news. Corruption is kind of something that's expected. It's the way of doing business. It's the way the world works. So data journalism actually has to go one step further than just proving corruption and saying, okay, well, we know this is happening. but is there data that helps us figure out, can we measure exactly how that corruption is happening? Can we measure who it's impacting, and can we measure how to solve it? So for example, one of our journalists in Pakistan 2 weeks ago published a story about education system in Baluchistan. And it's actually the best funded education system in the entire country. So per capita, it has the highest investment in education, and it's got the worst test scores. So what they had to look at was, okay, so is it that there's a bunch of ghost teachers? And he looked and saw that no, actually the teacher-student ratio is pretty good there. Well, is it that there's just all of these new kids in school who are uneducated and they're starting from the beginning? And they found, well, no, that's not really it either, because actually there's quite a lot of children still out of school. So they actually used data to narrow down, well, okay, well, what's happening exactly? And what they basically found was a lot of the money just wasn't being spent very well. It was being spent on hiring teachers, but they didn't really train the teachers. So yes, they had a warm body in all the classrooms, but the teachers didn't really exactly know what they were doing. So instead of just using data to point out that there's a problem and misspending of public funds, it's more about, can we dig a little bit deeper into the data and figure out, well, what are the possible solutions according to the data we have? And can we start telling stories, personal stories, about how applying solutions might improve the situation?
Just curious, just to follow up on that just a little bit, because I think the example in terms of, we're putting a lot of money into these schools, and they're getting the lowest test scores, and if you just looked at that data, you would be saying you would be led to be looking in one direction. What is the thing where you then actually are able to get the journalists to do that thing and look a little bit more deeply into the data and like start asking different things within it?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key lessons we've learned is to spend almost half of the time setting up the hypothesis that we're trying to investigate. So this journalist went in knowing his hypothesis is money is not the reason why this education system is failing. So my job is to figure out, well, what is the reason? A regular journalist would probably just report the surface level. We're spending all this money, it's not working, it must be because of corruption and misspending. It's terrible, the education system is terrible in Baluchistan. But that's not news. We know that the education system is terrible in Baluchistan. So what we're trying to get the journalists to understand is that's not enough anymore. That's not good enough. And that's not as easy to get journalists to realize as we thought it was. So a lot of it is sort of redefining the role of journalists to say, actually, your job is not just to measure the problem, but it's also to measure who's being impacted and what the solution might be.
So to definitely do that deeper dig. Natalia, what lessons have you learned through your work in this area?
So, hi there. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk to you today, guys. So one of the most valuable lessons I have learned since we started Gender and Number here in Brazil in the past August is that data itself is not compelling enough to make people take action about something. So I think let me just explain a little bit more about Gender and Number, which is the initiative I lead here in Brazil. It's an independent digital magazine that highlights gender issues through data-driven stories. So the idea came up when me and my partners realized that most of the stories about gender here were usually about anecdotes. They didn't bring enough context and didn't bring enough data about gender asymmetries. So we decided to start a magazine to put the data on the issue. And what we found out that the data itself is not compelling enough. So what is compelling is the stories that we can extract, the insights we can get from the data, and that give us much more context about a complex issue for our society. So when we bring the context and the people that are affected we can get emotion from our audience. We can get them involved, and it's much more efficient. So just to give an example, we published this story for the past elections here in Brazil that showed that more than 70% of all the cities didn't have not even one female candidate. But apart from this, we showed the number, and we also we went through the candidates to check who was participating in the elections. So we found out also that the people who were participating were also, because we have a quota here in Brazil to stimulate women participating in politics. So the female that were in the elections, they were mostly brought from by the parties to participate, so that they cannot be filed to not accomplish the legislation, the electoral legislation. So this was something that for us, that showed us that we need to go beyond the data, to go beyond the numbers, and highlight the people that are affected by the context.
And I think this point that you're raising in terms of the connection between data and story is so important. I see, Jesus, you're writing an agreement there in the text box. But it's interesting to me in terms of issues like feminism and also, working in marginalized communities, that, when you are having to combat that more patriarchal traditional mindset, that, data is really, really critical in terms of proving, right? Evidence-based argument becomes very important, but we still tend to lose people if we're not putting some compelling narrative in that, and getting some stories out there that people can connect to and grab onto and relate to, more importantly. And so, yeah, getting back to this thing over again is it's about this, you got to have really good story and really good narrative, but you also need to have data to sort of back up and make that argument in terms of like, here, how it is really impacting society and all that.
Exactly. Yes.
Curious in terms of, you're both of you are in places with at different sort of stages of democracy, and curious in terms of how you both see data-driven journalism as being important for democracy. Like what is its role? And Natalia, I'd love to stick with you on this just for a minute. Like how do you see data-driven journalism being very important, and particularly in the Brazilian context right now?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would say data-driven journalism, but because I think what is good for democracy is it's good journalism itself. So the journalism that give people the idea of the context and the information that they need to take informed decisions. So this is this is what important. And when we talk about data-driven journalism, the thing here is that the dimension of information that we produce nowadays are getting bigger, and we have our digital footprint. We produce digital data every day, every minute, with our mobiles and connected systems. So the issue right now is not to have information available, but to process the information. So this is something that the data-driven journalism brings to our field. So we start to think and to have new methodologies to process the data and to extract from it the context, the information, the qualified information that we need to take our decisions and to make government accountable, and the kind of thing that journalism has been doing since the beginning. So the importance of data-driven journalism for me is in this direction of like new methodologies and new techniques to deal with the big data, the big amount of data that we've been producing.
Great, and I mean, I think, yeah, you're right on in terms of making that connection of, you know, is it data-driven journalism or is it just good journalism? But, you know, likely the investigative journalism. But what, you know, this issue around like, how do we keep people in power accountable, right? And what is the role within that? Ava, would love to hear your take on this from your perspective.
Sure, and actually this touches on a little bit sort of what Natalia is trying to do. Just in terms of emerging democracies where the assumption is that everyone's voice is equal, I think data journalism has helped us lay the groundwork to get society to see that everyone's vote counts. So for example, a lot of laws were put in place for gender equality without really laying the groundwork for people to see women's role as equal. So we've done, for example, in Afghanistan, they did a data study to figure out why are women dropping out of government positions, and we found it was very practical reasons, like there wasn't bathroom space, or there was no separate place for women to pray, or there weren't childcare facilities. So for very practical reasons, women weren't taking up government posts set aside for them. And then also things like where in the country are men, or what demographics of men are more likely to support women in leadership positions. And we found that educated men and then men from certain regions of Afghanistan were quite open to the idea of women in leadership positions. So trying to use that to leverage programs that educate men about gender equality by sort of identifying who are the champions already. And then finally, just on a practical level, convincing men that having women in leadership positions is good for society. So we did another data study showing that educated women are more likely to vaccinate their children. They're more likely to achieve economic stability. So kind of on these various levels, trying to change attitudes towards gender equality in order kind of to set up the foundation for democratic participation equally across both genders.
And I mean, I love that in terms of that example where, you know, when you are using data to try to make an argument, right? You know, you're having to really convince, you know, men to think a little bit differently. And so if you can use that data where you're saying, you know, this part of the population or whatever benefits more greatly, the data shows this, right? And you can find a way to get around their thinking, right? That's really comes into a lot of power and all that. Ava, just stay with you just a minute, because and also just to honor what you were both saying in terms of, you know, it's not necessarily data-driven journalism, but it is about good journalism. And curious from your viewpoints, like, you know, fleshing out a little bit more of what does that good journalism look like? What does good journalism, what does it do? What does it look like?
Well, I think a big role in places in very corrupt countries is just holding governments accountable and fact-checking their statements, and making sure that marginalized groups are being represented. In Afghanistan, they were sort of declaring this big victory against the war on drugs, because basically they had this big campaign to arrest a lot of the people involved in the drug trade, and they'd arrested tens of thousands of people and put them in prison. But when you looked at the data of who they'd caught, they basically arrested impoverished farmers and drivers, who, when they sort of studied what exactly was their role, very low-level roles, and they were spending that money on their families. And now that they were in prison, the head of household was either their son or their wife. And most of them said, well, what will you do when you get out of prison? And they said, well, probably I'll go back to being a farmer or a driver for the drug cartels because that's the only job available, and I need to support my family. So sort of that sort of pragmatic role of, okay, well, what is the government saying in terms of what it's accomplishing, and what does the data say about how effective those policies are? And I think some of this information and data is coming out sort of at the think tank level, but getting that information to the public has been sort of a longer process of trying to figure out, well, whose role is it actually to fact check what politicians are saying and inform citizens about the effectiveness of the policies that they're putting in place.
So, I mean, but and for a journalist, because what I think you're sort of getting at is that there's a role where a journalism needs to be a little bit intuitive in terms of what is happening within society, and being able to be a bit responsive in terms of what sort of data are you looking for, and also how are you making that argument with it, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that there's this assumption that, oh, well, whatever the government says it's doing, it's not really of interest to us to fact check it or not, because it doesn't have anything to do with our lives. But when you start looking at data like, okay, well, if the government has an anti-corruption unit, but the country is still paying billions of dollars in bribes each year, they say, yes, we know rich people steal a lot of money, that's how they get rich, but how does that affect me? And when we the data journalists start to do the math and say, well, the $3 billion you pay in bribes each year is enough to reduce unemployment in Afghanistan by 20%. So 1 in 5 people, that's enough money. If you just give 1 in 5 unemployed people all of those bribes, that would mean that you reduce unemployment by 20%. And everybody knows someone who's unemployed. So everyone can relate to that calculation. So it's partially just getting these overwhelming numbers that people don't think have any impact on their day-to-day lives. And how do you localize that information so that they realize that, yes, these government decisions being made on this high level does impact your quality of life.
Right. And I think there's the thing too, in terms of, again, thinking about your audience and having that connection to the data. So, making that connection of this amount of money could pay for X, right? Like, and one of my favorite data visualizations that Global Witness has done is this amount of money that is going to corruption could actually pay for this amount of midwives, right? Mm-hmm. And making that connection in terms of how that money could be used for good within the society that is currently disappearing. Of course, we do also have these moments when those kinds of correlations, like the 350 million on the side of the bus, and what could be going to the NHS when it's completely misconstrued, right? And the data, there's no sort of fact checking on that data or holding those people accountable as well. So there is a slippery slope, but we do have to be very aware of audience, and it's really, really important. Natalia, let me bring you in here, because I know you've got great things to say about like what makes good journalism.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about data-driven journalism, the most important thing that we need to take into account is that data is like a regular source, and we need to not to trust it like 100%. So it can have its bias, it can bring interests behind the data. The data has its context, so it's like a regular source. We don't go to a human source and talk to her or him without like knowing who he or she is, or their context, or what could be their interests. So when we are working with data, we need to take all of this into account as well. And we we here in Brazil had an example in the last year when the government of São Paulo, the biggest city here, released official statistics about the rate of homicide in the city, and they showed that the homicide was falling down. But the statistics were completely biased, and what they showed with the data was just manipulated to serve to corroborate their stories. So we need to understand how the data is collected, what was the methodology behind it. So good data-driven journalism take all of this into account from my perspective.
That's great. And actually, I don't want to get you too far from that example in terms of Sao Paulo and the murder data or homicide data being far from what people in those communities knew. Because what I'd love to get you to comment on is within our data literacy ecosystem, like where do you see the gaps? Where are there problems within the data literacy ecosystem?
Well, one of the biggest gaps is the data collection methodology in terms of like how it's being used in data journalism. So we don't have a lot of journalists working with data collection and understanding how to produce their own data to contrast with the official data that sometimes are not trust at all. So this is something that comes in terms of power dynamics. So we have big corporations that are dealing with our data, and including our private data, and the governments as well. And how can we as activists, as civil society, as the academia, how can we take the step of produce our own data and contrast our own data with the official data from corporations, from governments. So for me, it's like to have more balance in this scenario where data is very, very valuable. So they are using data, and we are not enough prepared to contrast, to go beyond what they present us. So this is really important.
And I think the other thing too that is really critical. It's also it's not just giving communities or giving activists and advocates the ability to collect the data, but it's also about enabling them to get the data back out, right? So I think at one point you had been telling me about a story about the favelas producing their own podcasts and things like that.
Yeah.
Ways for them to get stuff out. And I know you're doing some efforts with that with School of Data there in Brazil, right?
Yes. So we had a project last year that was the goal was to form to teach young leaders from favelas in Rio to deal with data and to produce data about their communities. So we lack data from favelas. Even in the official data, we don't know what are the contexts of favelas. They don't bring this kind of information. So we had a 6-month extensive course on how to deal with data, how to produce data, and how to analyze data. And now these 6 young leaders are doing a podcast talking about their issues, the community issues, and in the perspective of information, lack of information, the gap in the official data. So they are producing also reflections related to this issue.
That's great. And you know, that sort of thing, that equalizing is so important. It's not just you know, enabling them to collect. It's also, you know, them being able to use things like the internet to get the word out. So Ava, I'm curious in from your perspective where you see gaps in the data literacy ecosystem.
I think for me, honestly, I work with a lot of difficult characters in developing countries and dictatorships who don't really understand data literacy. But I think the most difficult actors to work with are donors. And I think that donors are very much behind on the learning curve about how difficult it is to actually establish a basic level of data literacy. For years now, there's been a lot of buzz around boot camps and hackathons and MOOCs and all these kind of short-term, instant solutions to solving our challenge of data literacy. And we have plenty of data now showing that those short-term solutions are great for generating excitement, great for building community, and terrible for actually teaching data skills for data journalism. And I think donors are still sort of tight-fisted in terms of they want these quick, cheap solutions to this data literacy challenge. And I understand why, because they did put a lot of funding in data supply and creating data portals and opening up data, and then they realized nobody was using it. So they kind of want a quick fix to how do we get citizens engaged in sort of evidence-based decision-making, but unfortunately there isn't a quick fix. And you can look at Europe and the US as a perfect example. If it were easy, everybody would do it. But how many data journalists are there in Europe and the US? Not very many, because it's not that easy, right? So I think educating donors about what does an effective data literacy program look like, how much does it cost, who needs to be involved, is still a fight that we're having to fight donor by donor.
And just to say, I mean, to echo completely and in total agreement with what you said, but that, you know, I think one of our points with putting this series together is that we really wanted to point out that, you know, you can't just focus on one thing either for a short amount of time. It is the whole thing. So if you are doing the portal, right, you have to understand all the stuff that's going to go on around releasing that data and who are all the different actors that are going to be interacting with it. And you need to understand that before you release the data. Right. But then the other thing that I just think, you know, is so powerful, and particularly with your work, Ava, is you know, you're a really good example of the power of long-term engagement, right? So, you know, right, in order for these data-driven journalism teams to really get going in places, that does involve multiple years. It isn't just you going in for, you know, a week or two or even months, right? It really does take years to get these going.
Right, because we're interfering with the news cycle. Journalists usually, their job is to report news as it's happening, and their job is to record what is happening. So I think key to any data literacy program is finding journalists who actually are interested in exploring, well, what are the causes of what's happening? You know, if you're reporting about a hospital, about 5 people dying at a hospital over a weekend, what were the causes? Who was impacted by this? What is the solution to ensuring this doesn't happen? Do you need more doctors? Were they using bad medicine? It's a much more longer term intensive process than we realized. And I think you need to understand the entire data ecosystem, who's producing data, what journalists and what media outlets are willing to do that sort of long form, in-depth storytelling. Where is the audience for that kind of story? Are they interested in more human-driven reporting? Do they want more data visualization? It's an entire, you have to sort of understand the entire transparency cycle and in order to design an effective program, because if any link in the chain is broken, you're not going to see the kind of impact you're looking for.
Right, and also just to say that, you know, and the important role of CSOs, activism, and advocates in that, you know, they often have that deeper understanding as well in terms of like how do you make this argument for citizens to get them engaged in order to do stuff? So you do have to have that, like, you know, it takes a, I want to say it takes a village, but it, you know, it is the big ecosystem and all that. So Eva, also curious, from your perspective, and your unique perspective, you know, we've been hitting this thing, you know, known as post-fact and fake news, and that's been quite a meme here. And curious, in terms of your work, where you've been, has that had any impact on how you're doing things, or have you changed in any way?
I think it's been interesting to see how journalists react to things like Brexit and the Trump election, and how they view the way that US media use data versus how I've been telling them to use data. And one thing they say is, but Western journalists, they were just looking at polling data, and they were just talking about the left and the right, and they weren't actually analyzing policy. And I think sort of a unique perspective is that they come from they don't really have a very long independent media history. It was mostly, media has traditionally been a propaganda arm of the government. They're the mouthpiece for the government. So now that that's not true anymore, they sort of have this open playing field of, okay, well, what does a journalist do without this kind of pressure? And what I'm telling them that you do is you provide information for citizens to make informed decisions and to vote for whatever candidate is going to ensure that their kids have good education, that they have a good healthcare system. And they kind of looked at what happened in the West and said, but that's definitely not what data journalists were doing. They weren't looking at how is your healthcare going to be affected, or how is your education going to be affected if you vote for one candidate or another. And that's where I kind of went into, yes, but say as I do, not as say as I do, do as I say, not as we do, just because they're right. They're absolutely right. And part of the reason we ended up with the election results that we did was because data journalists weren't looking at policy. They weren't actually analyzing the facts about how these policies would impact their lives. And then we ended up with the elections and the results that we did.
So I mean, you know, you're at the more pre-fact bit with folks where the journalism haven't quite, or are starting to really grasp that idea of like really reporting on policy and facts and things that are really critical, and they haven't gotten to this bit yet in terms of being accused of misconstruing things and all that, right?
Right. There's still very much, oh, well, nobody's ever thought to look at what is the candidate's budget for healthcare spending over the next 5 years. They're used to voting on ethnic lines or religious lines, and actually evaluating a candidate's ability to govern is very new. And so it's also kind of an open playing field. So they'll be the first ones looking into this, looking into budget data, looking into healthcare statistics, looking into basically inequality issues, distribution of resources. They're the first journalists ever to report on that. So for them, being the first ones to report the facts in an election is a really exciting opportunity.
And so have to turn over to the other end of the pre-fact, post-fact spectrum, and Natalia, and what you're seeing in Brazil. How is that? How have you seen things change?
Yeah, I agree with Eva that we are still in the beginning of like the notion that journalists need to evaluate public policies. It's not something that we usually do in our daily work when we are covering hard news. So this is something that it's quite important when we want to face fake news, and we want to face the fake discourse from the authorities, candidates. But also one of the things that I've been seeing here in Brazil is that the media ecosystem has been changing in the past 2 years, and it's also about the how the information flows through internet and social media. So the mainstream media here don't have enough resource, enough structure to deal with fake news and to deal with like the need of context in the news, because they are so overwhelmed with hard news. And what we are facing here right now is a new ecosystem of independent media outlets that are bringing these, that are taking the role of bringing more context to the news and bringing more data. And like this is very exciting in the Brazilian context right now. So we have different new media outlets that are more worried about bringing data and bringing context. Like Nexo, I can give some examples, but it's like it's Brazilian. And even like my initiative is something that came up from this ecosystem of the need the need to go to the deep idea that media are not coming with the context that we need to take our decisions.
Right, and so you're in a situation where the commercial media is just focusing on the what is happened, and that bit on the on why is where the independent media is starting to really pick up the slack. And that, I mean, it's funny because I see that I mean, that's not a distinctly unique to Brazil, but it's interesting that you're seeing that evolution, and also like who is going to the independent media, like who's working for the independent media in producing those stories. Are those people that independent media have are just hiring? Are they new reporters, or are they using more long-term
traditional? Yes, because we've been facing a huge crisis in the mainstream media. So they are firing a lot of good senior journalists, and now they start to come up with their own media outlets, because they need to work, and we don't have enough space in the mainstream media right now because of the crisis.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's really interesting to me, is that the journalists and that they're finding a way to still do those in-depth stories that I'm assuming they've got a lot of passion for. Really great. I'm looking at the time and realizing that we've gotten some really great stuff out, but I do want to pause for a minute because I know there's been some questions in the chat room. So Caitlin, do you want to tell us what our lovely participants have come up with in terms of questions or comments?
Hi, yeah, sure. So one of the questions that came out from Jesus was a question about ethics. So what he wrote in the chat is on the topic of ethical use of data, from finding to cleaning to using and reporting / visualizing, and data literacy. Is this is this with great data? So with great data comes great responsibility. So are we focusing enough on data and ethics? So I thought that some of the conversations that we were having around kind of vulnerable and marginalized communities, this might be a good question to address. How are you thinking about data and ethics, and how are you instilling ethical data practices in the people that you train?
If either one of you have a question, you're welcome to start, or have an answer, not a question.
Okay, let me just give my perspective. When we did the course in the favelas with the young leaders, one of the things that we were worried about was exactly the ethics of data. How could we teach them that we need to balance the access to information and also the privacy, the issues of algorithms. So we included all of these ideas and brought some texts, brought some examples for them to reflect on it and to discuss it. So it was very, very interesting. It was the first time that we did kind of like module about data ethics, and it was quite good. So now we are thinking here in Brazil in School of Data to add in all of our courses at least 1 or 2 days of conversations, of talking and discussions about data ethics, bringing some examples and discussing the power dynamics of like collecting and analyzing data. So this is something that we are doing here right now.
That's great. Ava, you have anything?
Yeah, I think you phrase that in a more optimistic way than I do. I usually say a little data is a dangerous thing. So I think that's one of the risks of things like boot camps is you teach everyone just enough to be dangerous. So before we get to any kind of data visualization, they do have to go through a data ethics module. And the way I kind of try to explain it is because everybody wants to do data visualization. And to me, that's like everyone saying, I'm in a house building class and I want to paint my house. I'm concerned that your house is structurally sound. You can paint it the prettiest color you want, but if the structure isn't sound, the color will be deceptive, right? It'll look nice, but it won't actually hold up to anything. So I think that's one of the things that the data literacy practitioners should stop and think about is, do they have enough time to go through responsible data use unit, through the ethics of data visualization, through privacy discussions? And I like the way Natalia framed that as discussion, because there's a lot of gray area when it comes to privacy and policy, and really make them think critically about what's the purpose of the data that they're using, and how do they both explain it in narrative and through visualizations in an ethical way.
And it's funny because I think the the thing with ethics is that it can be that's when we start really getting into the gray area, right? And it's really critical in terms of ethics, I think, for people to have these conversations about them, so that it's not about like having a clear yes or no, but more of the sense of like how to navigate ethical quagmires as they're coming up, both in terms of how you are using data, but then what are our ethical stuff around collecting data, and then that final of like how is the data being displayed and all that sort of stuff. So there's not an easy yes or no to these things. It is the bit of understanding when you are doing damage, right? When you are making people more vulnerable, and that maybe the argument is not as worthwhile, as important as then proving X, right? So it's a big thing. Anything else, Caitlin?
Yeah. So another question was from the very beginning of the discussion, and it actually emerged when Eva, you were talking about the schools, the data journalism around schools in Pakistan. And so one of the questions was like, when you're working in these contexts, like how are you finding the relevant data? So, it wasn't just budget data and how many schools there were and how many teachers there were. You needed to find information on how they were training their teachers. Like, how are you teaching people to find that kind of more interesting data?
And I think that question, it actually goes back to understanding the data ecosystem, because in a lot of these countries where there's either not very good or not very granular government data, a lot of times CSOs and academia is filling in that gap. And they might be collecting good data, but they're fairly distrustful of working with journalists because their findings have been misconstrued in the past. Journalists are also skeptical of CSOs and what their agenda and what their politics are. So there is data, some of the quality, again, just like the quality of data journalism varies, the quality of data being collected by CSOs varies. So what we've done a lot is actually bring these CSOs that are doing data collection. So the example I talked about in Afghanistan about men and sort of where men more open towards women in leadership positions, that was a survey done by an NGO. A lot of the data about children in Pakistan, especially in Balochistan, was also collected by a Pakistani education NGO that does province by province surveys. And again, there's a lot of sort of data literacy and methodology questions that the journalists have to sort of sit down with the CSO to understand how the data was collected, what the sample was, things like that. But once you sort of set up that relationship at the beginning, then it can be a really useful relationship for both the CSO and the journalist, because the CSO can inform the journalist, hey, we have a new data release on whatever, our evaluation of curriculum quality across Pakistan. Do you want to do a story on it? And then the journalist sort of has that scoop on that issue as soon as the data study comes out, and the CSO has more press on their findings. So I think building up that relationship in areas where the data might be in different places, it's not all just from the government, is really key to producing effective data journalism.
I love that too. I just have to say the like, you know, using data or collecting data as a way to make bridges, you know, between journalists and NGOs and stuff is just, yeah, cool. I mean, it's really cool. Sorry.
And another question that I had that didn't come out of the chat, but I'm going to use my facilitator's privilege and ask my own question, is, so one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is, I mean, Ava, you and I could rant for days about why boot camps are not effective. But often, you know, we're not just talking about independent journalists. Often, more often than not, journalism is done through newsrooms. And I wanted to hear a little bit about your experience working in newsrooms, which are institutions, which have a tendency to be a little bit slow to change, and how you talk with newsrooms and editors and things like that about embedding data culture within newsrooms, whether there were tools, techniques, things that you've been able to do and see work in embedding a data-driven culture, I guess.
I guess from my sort of pre-digital convergence perspective, my strategy with editors and publishers is to scare them. Basically telling them the business model of breaking news is no longer going to be relevant. People will get their breaking news off of Facebook and Twitter. So what is their content going to offer that people can't get from citizen journalists or whomever, from relatives off of Facebook and Twitter? And so what we're saying is it more context in this sort of fire hose of information that they're going to be receiving. What kind of content that offers context, that it offers analysis, will they provide? And also selling them on interactive storytelling, immersive storytelling, sort of smoothing this path towards digital convergence can be an effective way to say, look, you're going to have more informative, more engaging content for your audience, for a digital convergence that sooner or later is going to happen. So that was effective in Kenya, which now has the Nation Newsplex, which is a 4-person data team in the biggest daily newspaper in Kenya. And then also in Afghanistan, it's a permanent data team at Pajwak news agency, which is distributed through media throughout the country, also has a permanent data team because they bought into this idea that, yes, it's worth the investment to have just part of our content that's more data driven and have a few people dedicated to this sort of more innovative kind of content production, and then see how it goes as an experiment. And so far, it seems to be spreading. And then also other media outlets kind of see what they're doing and get interested themselves about just in interest of competition.
And Natalia, do you have anything to add on to that?
Well, I agree with Caitlin that we need to think about the new methodologies to teach data in the context of newsrooms, because I have an experience, a recent experience about this. We trained Folha de São Paulo here in Brazil, which is the biggest mainstream newspaper. And they were quite excited about like having lessons on data journalism, but at the end of the course, the reporters didn't have enough time to get and to work with the information that we were teaching them, because they were so overwhelmed with like all of the stuff that they need to do in the daily basis, that they couldn't use in a practical way what we were teaching them. So we need to think like, how can we engage these people in a different way that is not in a short-term way, but it's like more long-term, so they can apply what they learn in their job, and it's very hard when we face the crisis that the mainstream media are going through right now. So they need to first of all, they need to rethink the business model and the approach they have with news. So I agree, not with Caitlin, with Eva about this.
I think you're all in it. I think everyone's in agreement on that. I just want to point out, it is at the top of the hour, and I have just two more questions for our guests. But to say, for those of you that are participating, if I know it's at the top of the hour and we are likely to lose you soon. So first of all, just want to say thank you for participating, and also for the great comments and stuff that you guys have put in. And to say that we will be following up with, we'll send you an email with where to get the stuff, the podcasts and outputs from this session. So don't worry, if you run off, we will email you and let you know how to get a hold of all this stuff. Caitlin, is it okay if I now switch to our final questions?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. So what I really want to give you guys an opportunity to do is, is to do some plugging. So is there anything in terms of your own work that you want to plug? And I'll start with Eva.
Sure. I am, as of yesterday, I'm recruiting for journalists who are interested in participating in a 1-month data journalism training institute that I'll be running in Albania in July and August. So I'll drop the link into the chat. It's open to any young journalists and graduating journalism students from the Balkans. So if you can distribute among your network, that would be great. And again, it's oriented towards teaching all the data journalism skills necessary for producing public interest reporting with an anti-corruption angle.
Great. Thank you. Natalia.
Yeah, I just want to plug in the website of Gender and Number for those who want to know it. But it is in Portuguese. I'm sorry for that. But we just launched a new issue the last week, and we have a session that we called code source code. And in this session, we talk a lot about methodologies of analyzing data. So it's interesting, and they did the past works that we did. So take a look if you want. And also, I want to recommend the La Nación data website. I'm checking the link here because they've been doing a fabulous work with data in Latin America, and they are finalists in Data Journalism Awards this year. They've been finalists all the years, but this year they have a very nice project that also is related to data collection. So I would recommend you guys to take a look. I'm gonna put the link here.
Great, thank you. And also, just Ava, do you have any resources or readings or things that you've seen around data literacy that either excite or inspire you?
Yes, actually, what Natalia just mentioned, the 2015, what year are we at? 2017 Global Data Journalism Awards finalists were announced last month. Both the Pakistan team and the Afghanistan team are on the list if you want to check out their stories. But mostly it's just a fantastic collection of data journalism being done all over the world. It's a great place for ideas and also to see if we succeed in data literacy, what does success look like? And I think a lot of these finalists sort of embody this is exactly what we want to happen when data literacy training is effective. Great.
And also just, Caitlin, if you don't mind, I'll jump in on this because I think the things that our participants are sharing are super important. So just want to give a shout out to Rob Davison, your excellent recommendation for the Responsible Data Forum as being a great resource for data ethics for field practitioners. We will definitely include the Oxfam case study that you linked when we put the final resources for this together. And also just to say, Jesus, you've mentioned this MOOC run by Alberto Cairo and Heather Cruz on data exploration and storytelling, big focus on data journalism. Great to have that recommendation. If you actually could put a link in there and save me from doing a search later, I would certainly appreciate it, but I will look for it if you do not. And then just to ask Caitlin, do you think we have anything else before I wrap this up?
No, I think that's great.
Great. Oh, and Natalia, you just put another one in, right?
Yes, this is really, really interesting. It's a visual way to understand statistics and probability that was put together by a bunch of students from Brown University. It's really interesting.
Great. We will take a look at that. So with that, I have to say this concludes our second online conversation for data as a team sport. And it's been great to do this deep dive into not just data-driven journalism, but good journalism and thinking about what that looks like and how important it is to our societies and our democracies. Just big thank you, Ava Constantaras and Natalia Mazotte. But also want to do a big thanks to Caitlin Rogers and School of Data for making this happen. Our next episode and online conversation for Data as a Team Sport will take place in 2 weeks on Thursday, June 22nd. Stay tuned to the School of Data website for more information on that. As I mentioned, you can find the notes from these conversations along with the links to the video recordings of the Hangout on the School of Data website at schoolofdata.org. Have I mentioned the podcast series? You can find it on the School of Data website, and today we are also on the iTunes store. So just search for Data as a Team Sport, and it will also soon be on Stitcher. Our first episode features Lucy Chambers and Rahul Bhargav's conversation on enabling learning. And have to end just saying a big thank you to the participants, the people that showed up today, and also our listeners. We hope this has benefited and informed your own data literacy efforts. So thank you very much. And that's it. I'm hitting stop. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.